The central banks and governments of the world are throwing everything and the kitchen sink at the markets to keep our bubble economy alive. Today, we will uncover the actions that are taken by the Bank of Japan and the Japan's government to fight the deflation that is trying to bring the economy back into reality. This is the second part to the previous video, Economic Crisis 2020, Why is this happening? Where I talked about the reasons that this crisis is unfolding, so feel free to check that video out as well. Just a day ago, from the moment of writing this sentence, the Bank of Japan declared that they will commit to purchasing unlimited amounts of Japan government bonds. To me, this marks a critical moment where it is now self-evident that Japan is monetizing the debt. Debt monetization is just a fancy word, which means that the country is funding its expenses by money printing. Countries such as Venezuela, Zimbabwe, and of course the Weimar Republic are prime examples of how this policy tends to play out. One last thing I have to say before getting into the meat of this video is that the situation is still very fluid, and I wouldn't be surprised if by the time you see this video there are already new government programs and additional central bank stimulus announced. Alright, let's get into it. I will first introduce the fiscal side, in other words, how the government is responding, and after that we will look into the countless operations of the out-of-control Bank of Japan. As expected, the numbers used in this video can feel too large to comprehend, so you can use the GDP of Japan, which is about 500 trillion yen, as a point of reference. So what is the government doing? The stimulus package, which they have named Emergency Economic Measures to Cope with COVID-19, consists of two phases. The first is the emergency support phase. This phase has two steps. The first is called Measures to Prevent the Spread of the Infection, build medical treatment structures, and develop pharmaceuticals. This means securing a supply of masks, disinfectant, and other medical supplies, as well as enhancing testing and developing pharmaceuticals and vaccines. I'm quite unsure if government is best suited to allocate capital in the first place, but at least the intentions seem to be well placed. I will put the link in the description so you can see the details for each of these steps if you want. The fiscal spending that is allocated to this step is written to be 2.5 trillion yen. The second step is called Protecting Employment and Keeping Business Viable, which, as you can guess, is about giving direct assistance and cheap loans to companies to keep them afloat, as well as supporting the companies by paying for their employees, sometimes even 100% of their salary. The government has also agreed to provide everyone living in Japan 100,000 yen, which is about $1,000. Someone might even consider this to be an introduction to universal basic income in Japan. Whether this payment will be one-time relief like during the Great Financial Crisis, or transform into a permanent government program remains to be seen. This step has an allocation of 30.8 trillion yen, making it 12 times bigger than the allocation for the medical actions. These two steps were part of the emergency phase, which is followed by something the government has named V-shaped recovery phase, implying that once the coronavirus situation has been dealt with, the government will stimulate the economy to induce a rapid bounce back to where it was before. The first step of the V-shaped recovery phase is called Recovery of Economic Activities through Public and Private Cooperation as the next phase. This means that the government will organize campaigns to encourage people to go to restaurants, events, and travel. To achieve this, they are planning to give out discount coupons, cashback campaigns, or loyalty points to encourage spending. Being innovative in their naming sense, the government has named this as Go-To campaign, Supporting the delayed Tokyo Olympics in 2021 and promoting Japan to potential tourists around the world is also part of this step. I also noticed how the government is cramming programs into the emergency package that they have been planning to do since last year, even before the corona shock. One example is the Point program, which links your individual number card, or as they call it in Japan, My Number Card, to an electronic payment system of your choice. People can then receive these Points when they charge money into their mobile payment applications, for example. There are many reasons this whole scheme smells like rotten fish, for the reasons I talked about in my video about cashless payments in Japan. Anyway, the allocation for all this spending stimulation step is written to be 3.3 trillion yen. The next step or spending category during this V-shaped recovery is called making economic structure resilient. This apparently includes supporting certain businesses to bring supply chains back to Japan, supporting overseas Japanese businesses, implementing something they referred to as the Digital New Deal, where schools are to assign each student a laptop and businesses to promote remote work, among many other things. This step has currently an allocation of 10.2 trillion yen of fiscal spending. The last category is called preparing for the future, establishment of new contingency funds. And this one has an allocation of 1.5 trillion yen, as a kind of a backup when more funds are needed for whatever reason. So overall, the government has agreed to spend 48.4 trillion yen. Some of you may have heard this amount to be around 117 trillion yen, but this number only represents the estimate of the total effect on the economy that this 48.4 trillion could have. Essentially, the government is only saying, hey, look at how much we are doing to help the economy, like a pufferfish full of air. Even if they were actually spending 117 trillion yen, I don't think it would be better, as they are only spending the taxpayers' money, either from directly taxing them or by hitting them with inflation through the central bank money printer. Speaking of central banks, let's take a look at what the Bank of Japan has been up to fight the scary deflation monster. The method Bank of Japan provides stimulus to the markets is by purchasing different financial assets with currency that they can type into existence. These purchases are happening all the time, even before the coronavirus shock. But we want to know how much have they increased the purchasing amount of each asset compared to so-called normal times. Let's start with the most obvious, that is the Japan government bonds, or JGBs. Yeah, the one that Bank of Japan is now claiming to buy without a limit. When we talked about the government fiscal spending, just know this is partly how they finance these spending packages. The government writes beautiful pieces of paper that say something along the lines of, we will totally pay you back because we are the government. After this, the Bank of Japan buys them away. Or actually, they have some banks in the middle of this transaction, so it doesn't fall into the definition of debt monetization. Anyway, the monthly amount of JGBs the Bank of Japan has been purchasing has increased from around 6 trillion yen in the last December to around 9 trillion yen in April. Because part of the fiscal measures are funded by these JGBs, we won't add these amounts to the total sum. The reason I wanted to show you this is to highlight the increasing demand for the Bank of Japan to monetize the debts of the government, for them to be able to execute all of those fiscal spending packages I addressed earlier. Now let's see how much commercial paper and corporate bonds the Bank of Japan has been purchasing. For anyone wondering, the difference is that commercial paper is generally short term, usually about 30 days. Corporate bonds, on the other hand, is longer term loans that can take even years to expire. Here is a graph that shows how much the Bank of Japan has bought commercial paper and corporate bonds each day. Compared to corporate bonds, the amount of commercial paper has been significantly larger and ever more increasing throughout the spring. Cumulatively, the Bank of Japan bought about 2.9 trillion yen worth of CP and corporate bonds since March. This assistance is disproportionately directed at large corporations that have the option to issue these kinds of debt instruments. By looking at each auction day, we can observe that the interest rate that the Bank of Japan purchases these is very close to zero, so they are practically lending these corporations money for free. Next up is the most controversial aspect of the Bank of Japan operations, the purchasing of stocks. Central banks purchasing stocks of private companies has been largely thought inappropriate for good reasons. After all, having a quasi-state government entity counterfeit currency to acquire ownership in a private company is essentially communism. Nevertheless, Japan has decided to support the languishing stock market with the help of the Bank of Japan. The current result is that the Bank of Japan owns roughly 5% of the total Japanese stock market. Since the start of March, they have purchased about 3 trillion yen worth of stocks in the shape of ETFs, or exchange-traded funds. Propping up asset prices like this is probably the most blatant method to penalize the masses through inflation in order to help the rich stockholder minority. Yet, this has become the everyday function of the Bank of Japan. There are some other inflationary operations that the Bank of Japan performs, like the repurchase agreements. But in order to simplify, we will leave these for another video. So, if we add up everything except the Japan government bonds, as this amount is technically spent by the government, the asset purchases for the commercial paper and stocks add up to about 6 trillion since March. It is interesting how the amount of money that went into supporting asset prices was over twice the amount that went into directly fighting the coronavirus through the medical field. Totaling the fiscal and the monetary spending together, we seem to be hovering around 54 trillion yen, which would be around 10% of Japan's GDP. I think that by the time you are watching this video, many of the allocations have doubled or tripled in amount, and I don't even dare speculate on what the final spending amount will look like. Anyway, I hope you learned something about the actions that Japan's government and the Bank of Japan are taking to combat the deflationary effects that the coronavirus is helping to aggravate on the economy. I will see you in the next video.